Alireza Firouzja was rewriting the rules about castling at Tata Steel 2021. So this was his round 8 game. It was played against Pentala Hari Krishna. Hari Krishna had white, so let's see what happened here. And if you love a daily chess video, do hit that subscribe button to never miss one. So Firouzja played the Slav defense, and unfortunately we had this exchange variation. It can lead to very dry positions here because the pawn structure is symmetrical. We don't have any of this d takes on c4 stuff. We had pawn to e3 now, bishop to f5, and bishop to b5 now from Hari Krishna. So you could come to d3 there, but then it gets even drier with these bishops getting exchanged off. So instead bishop b5, e6 now from Firouzja, knight to c3, and now knight to e7. Firouzja starts to mix it up in the best way he can. He doesn't bring the knight to f6 and play very symmetrically, and we'll see how this now pans out. So rook to c1 was played, pawn to a6 now that you can recapture here with the knight. The bishop dropped back to e2, and now pawn to f6 from Firouzja. So with the knight not sitting there, he now commits a pawn, covers the key e5 square, and also prepares e5 at a later point potentially. And now to be fair to Hari Krishna, he also mixes things up here with pawn to g4, but it makes a lot of sense because if you go knight to f3 there, e5 is well covered, and you have to be careful not to get too passive as white. So the bishop drops back, we had knight to f3 now, and now bishop into f7 is nice prophylaxis, getting the bishop out of the way and clearing g6 for the knight. We had bishop g3 now, and pawn to h5 from Firouzja. So here we go. He loves to chuck that h-pawn. He was doing it so much this tournament, really in his style. The pawn kicked on to g5 here, the knight came to g6, and now there's a threat here. So black is threatening to go pawn to h4, trapping that bishop. How does white respond? Well, there are a couple of key ways. There's how Hari Krishna played, and he could have played instead pawn to h4. You suspect Firouzja would have played like this in an instant, just throwing that pawn, keeping the space. Instead, he took here on g6, and this allows a really interesting sequence now. So the pawn wasn't recaptured. Instead, h4 was played. Really nice move. So you're temporarily giving up a pawn after the capture on g7. The bishop recaptured, and now this bishop came into e5. f4 was also an option, but black now wins back the pawn after this exchange here, and black has also won the bishop pair. So a really nice transition there, plus there's some nice central pawns here, and some pressure coming on the king side. So knight d4 from white now, at least you get to establish this nice central knight. Rook to c8. Castles from white might look a bit scary, but the king is going to sit on h1, and then even white could look to use the g-file potentially. And now knight c6 from Firouzja was a really nice repositioning of that knight. It opens up the dark squared bishop, and you challenge this strong central piece that white has. Bishop g4 from Hari Krishna, he activates that piece, eyes this backwards e6 pawn. We had the exchange here, the pawn recaptured, and now rook to c6. It lends support to e6 and clears some room for the queen to maybe activate to one of these squares. Knight e2 now from Hari Krishna. So interesting stuff. He opens up the knight immediately rather than play rook to e1 or pawn to h3. So he wants to improve that piece, which wasn't going anywhere with the e4 square covered. He also creates tension on the c-file. Now the computer loves black to just take here, say queen recaptures and then castles, and it gives black as a bit better. But is this Firouzja's style? Of course it's not. So he plays for the more aggressive line here. He plays pawn to h3, leaving the rook where it is, chucking a pawn at the enemy king. We now had rook to c3 from Hari Krishna. Arguably he should take there, give black these pawns and try and get some play against them with his queen on the light squares. But now he's responding to Firouzja's threats instead. Always a risky policy against a player like Alireza. So rook h4 comes now, a really beautiful rook lift, taking advantage of how that pawn moved. The rook defends, the queen activated to c7. So Firouzja now dominates that c-file and looks menacingly down here. Rook to e1 from white, so bringing that rook to the half-open file. King f8 from Firouzja, so he steps off that file finally and finally does something for his king safety on move 25. Awesome, aggressive stuff from young Alireza. Queen d3 now from Hari Krishna. So he's seeking to activate the queen like this and actually bring it across to give a check here and try and get the queens off the board. Because after Firouzja goes pawn to e5, breaking in the centre, a classic strike when you've got the bishop pair, you want to open lines, we now have the check coming. And you can't really afford to step to the g-file here, that's just too much when you've got the rook already lined up there. So the queen had to block, we had these ones coming off, and now the bishop took on h3. So white has won that h-pawn. This was Hari Krishna's idea, that he can take there with the queens off. There's less pressure on the h-file. But Firouzja captures here, and we can see he's starting to rip open the position for his bishop pair. Beautiful classic play when you've got that bishop pair. So knight c1 now. Excellent move from Hari Krishna. He begins this blockading move. So the rook now remaneuvered across to the h-file, pressuring the bishop, which retreated. And now Firouzja picked up here. So although he's won that h-pawn, white's not so scared because he does have the h1 square covered, so there's no extra checks down there. And it has taken Firouzja some time to do that, so the knight now gets to come to d3, blockading those pawns. And as long as they're sat there, these bishops are going nowhere, as we can see. So the rook dropped back here, and now I really don't like Hari Krishna's next move. I think he had to go knight to c5 here. You pressure this pawn here, ask black how he wants to play, and at some point you could potentially drop back, maintain a blockade, or there could be knight d7 check ideas, but you just can't do what he did, which is push this f-pawn immediately, because you open up the king in a really deadly way here, and although in some positions you want to commit this f-pawn, it's just a bit too soon to do so right now with how black is manoeuvred. So the rook comes to c6 now, hitting that open file, and you're not in time to challenge it here really, because after captures here, knight takes, there's rook into h4. We immediately see the weakness of that last pawn push, and if you defend with knight d3, then bishop h6 is strong, hitting that pawn a second time, and there's no comfortable way to defend it. If you try going with the rook, then you're running into big problems after bishop g6. There's a lot of problems coming in here on the light squares, as we can see. So we didn't have this sequence. After rook c6, bishop f3 was played, hitting that rook, which dropped back. Rook g2 now covers this square. And now Firouzja brings a rook to the g-file, challenging this strong piece, which is holding the white position together. Now white doesn't necessarily want to take here, because then you activate the light squared bishop, and you can recapture with the bishop, leaving the defense of this pawn, because if white picks that up, you lose the knight on d3, and this is no good as a sequence, because the passed pawn, along with the bishops, is going to win the game. So that's why white didn't take that rook on g6, and so instead he goes pawn to f5, kicking the rook out of that g6 square. Now Firouzja, for his part, doesn't want to take here, activate the king, then it's not so easy to make progress. So he plays rook h6, keeping some tension, asking white how he wants to proceed, and immediately Hari Krishna goes wrong here. So knight to f4 was played, and there's a big problem with this move. If you want to pause and look for it, then I'd encourage you to do so. So pawn to d3 was played here. Excellent move. The knight captured that pawn. Why has Firouzja given a pawn? Well, this deadly check comes. You've opened up that bishop. And there's big problems now for white. If you move the king across here, then we actually have the move rook to h3. Hitting this one here, and it's very tricky to actually defend. If you step up with the king, then the other rook enters with decisive effect. And if you try and block with the rook, well, we're simply picking up an exchange there. So that's why we didn't have the king moving. Instead, the knight blocked the check. Now this rook entered anyway. We had king to f1 here, breaking the pin. And now there's no rook to h3 or h1 because the knight is covering those squares. So instead Firouzja just picked up this pawn on b2, not rushing the position. He's now a pawn ahead, still has the bishop pair and a big attack. So rook e2 was played to try and trade off, rook b1 check, the rook came back, and now the other rook doubled on the b file, preparing to recapture there. Knight d3 was played. Hari Krishna's trying to get those pieces back into the game. We had bishop c3 hitting the rook. This forced the exchange on the b file here, and the king came up to f2. So there's only a pawn in it for black, but the big problem here is white's just got a very exposed king, the pieces aren't so coordinated, and those bishops are raking across the board, as we can see. So king e7, Firouzja starts activating that king, just what you want to do in endgames. We had rook h2, so Hari Krishna's trying to activate here. Now king to f6, king to e3, king to g5, and now knight to c5, so the knight finally lands on that juicy square, putting some pressure here, but it's all just really tricky now for white, who's a lot of tempos down on some of the earlier positions. So rook b5 comes, hitting that knight. We had rook to h7, counter attack on the bishop, and you don't want to take like this, because after the rook captures, the challenge here is, say you go pawn to b5, although you're still that pawn up, this time white has a passed f-pawn, and it's a bit more tricky, a bit more dangerous, giving white that counterplay. So instead of this, Firouzja goes for a much cleaner line with bishop to g8 here. He hits that rook. Now there's no rook g7 check, don't blunder your rook with the bishop from afar. So that's why the rook moved across here instead, to hold this knight. But now it allows Firouzja to pick up that pawn on f5. White can pick up this b7 pawn, yes, but after pawn d4 check, this is a much nicer position for black. There's no counterplay here, and this d pawn is now deadly, really difficult to stop. Now you could have come into d3 here, but then after rook b2, a mating net is being formed here. You'd have to give up the exchange or something soon. So that's why Hari Krishna went with the king in this direction, but now rook b2 check comes anyway. The bishop blocked like this, and Hari Krishna's setting up a tactic. If d3 using that pin, then he can take here. Now this is still very good for black actually, after rook takes, should be winning. But once again, Firouzja wanted to play in a slightly cleaner manner, so instead he went king to f4, continued activation there. There's no check on f7 as we note. The knight came back into d6. Bishop d2 was now played, so the pawn can now advance without any problems of being captured. It's also preparing to bring the bishop in here. We had king to f1, preempting that threat of the check here, but now the king is just in so much trouble getting boxed in. So rook b1 check came, and here Hari Krishna blocked with the bishop. Say you go king to g2 here, well this check on d5 is deadly. After the king moves away, this is actually mate in the corner of the board. Beautiful combination of rook and bishop there. So that's why the king couldn't step away. The bishop blocked here. And again, Firouzja could take here, but then king e2, you're hitting both of these pieces. It's still very good for black after bishop a5, counter-attacking here. But why go for complications? Why start calculating when you can simply play pawn to d3? You shut down the idea of a king e2, the bishop is still pinned, and the game's completely done. So in this position, Hari Krishna actually resigned. If you enjoyed this game, then do subscribe to the channel to never miss a future video, and see more amazing Firouzja games, click here. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon.